Hey there everybody, and welcome to D&D Doge's Emporium of Dungeons & Dragons Horror Story Cringe. Sometimes, tabletop RPGs can be brought down by some terrible players, and in some other cases, the Dungeon Master themselves. And in today's episode, we take a look at both cases. But before we get into that, if you enjoy what I do here, consider clicking that like button and leaving a comment, as it helps satiate the algorithm dragon. Also, subscribe if you haven't done so already. That way you can see more of my videos, and more of Alice being insane. But with that said, let's get into these stories. The DM that refused to prep sessions and would just make things up to eat session time. By Reddit user Ryan X Wanbin. There's a key recommendation to upcoming DMs that I think a lot of people misinterpret. The suggestion to learn to improvise is a great one, because as all DMs will know, your party will eventually surprise you and venture into a direction you did not expect. This is advice that any DM should follow, or they're forced to relegate to the railroad when the party takes an alternate route. But some people think you should only improvise and make bare bones preparation. And maybe there are some really good DMs out there that have the ability to do that, but for most people, prep is absolutely key to making a good game. And here is why. I joined a homebrewed game about an empire that was currently going through political turmoil and losing foreign wars, greatly weakening it. It sounded very similar to my own game, so I joined up. I decided to play an Inquisitor-type character, trying to re-strengthen the Empire by any means necessary. If the other players happened to want to rebel, then my character would be flexible enough to think that new revolution was necessary. We start the session off with the other two party members, Ranger and Bard, hanging around a tavern as I come in to investigate a town. The bartender tells us bandits have been raiding the town, and the local magistrate is looking for volunteers. Cool. The other party members hear this, and being low on coin, decide to join up with me. After about an hour of talking and introductions, we decide to head our way to the magistrate. When suddenly, a nearby man grabs my character's hand and tells me to play card games with him. My character refuses. He's here on business, but the man is insistent. We refuse thrice, and he still won't relent, causing my character to glare at him and ask if he's interfering with Inquisitor business. The DM asks me for an intimidation roll, and after a success, finally leaves us alone. We attempt to leave the bar, only to be stopped by the waitress. The waitress starts talking about how cool and powerful the party looks, and then starts bragging about her own life out of nowhere. We talk and try to leave, only for her to now offer services for gold. We refuse. She's insistent, and we again have to refuse several times before she finally backs off. But before we can, the ranger has to make a con save for the one ale he drank 30 minutes ago, and when he fails, goes unconscious, and we have to spend the next 10 minutes trying to wake him up. Finally, outside of the tavern, we come across a beggar asking for money. We refuse, considering everyone is low on gold, and we try to move on, only for the beggar to start clinging to the ranger's leg. Ranger has to roll athletics, and when he fails, tumbles to the ground while the beggar begs for money, and I have to draw my sword to get him to back off. As we make our way to the magistrate, a random man on horse suddenly attacks us. Ranger shoots him and knocks him off the horse. The bard heals him up, and we demand answers for why he attacked us. The man is very nonchalant in his attitude, refusing to answer even under the threat of sword. After asking him multiple times and threatening, he finally answers that he's part of some noble house and thought that we were from a rival house. My character is incensed, asking why he would think total random strangers he saw were from a rival house, and the man just shrugs, going on and on about how he hates the rival house. I almost execute the man right there, only for us to be attacked again by another horseman, with the DM telling us that this time, it's a man from a rival house. The bard decides to cast Dissonant Whispers on the horse, and we tell the DM flatly that we just run away so we don't have to deal with any of this. We finally make it to the magistrate, only for the guard in front to ask each of us who we are, and we need to give our background stories that we had already said back at the tavern. As the clock finally hit its 4th hour of session time, the DM starts clapping his hands and goes, "Perfect! The session went exactly 3 hours as I wanted. See you next week, folks." And if it wasn't obvious by now, the DM was throwing every single thing he could think of to prevent us from actually meeting the magistrate. He was throwing every single little thing at us to eat up the session time as much as possible. It was pretty annoying, but maybe he didn't have enough time to prep. But the next week is exactly the same. The magistrate greets us and tells us that we have to see a lieutenant at the other side of town for details on the bandits. We just spent 3 hours getting to this guy, and he tells us that we have to see someone else. The bard asks why in the world he wouldn't have the information on the bandits, and the magistrate shrugs and says that it's not his position to know military affairs. So off we go to meet this lieutenant, only for a freaking storm to suddenly appear. The storm is so strong, the rain so heavy, the wind so powerful that midway through the town, we are forced to rest in a nearby house. In the house is a granny, and we offer her 1 gold piece from each of us after explaining our situation. The granny offers us food, and we tell her no thanks since we're already in her home and have rations. When we try to sleep, the granny then requests each of us to start fixing things in her house. A leaky roof, broken cupboard, a rat hiding in a corner, and a dirty cooking pan, all of which requires rolls for more time. An hour is spent in Granny's house before we can finally rest and move on. We meet the lieutenant, who again asks us for our backstories and why we want to help clear the bandits. And finally, he tells us that there are about 8 of them in a nearby forest. We go into the forest, only to be stopped by fallen trees blocking our way. All 3 of us have to roll athletics about 5 times to clear the trees, and the DM goes to painstaking descriptions of how our characters' backs hurt, we feel tired, and our hands are itchy if we roll anything below a 10. The DM then tells us that it's been half a day, and that we need to make camp and long rest again. We decide to forage for food, and then the DM starts listing off every single animal and vegetable he can think of. The bard tells him that he just wants to find vegetables that aren't poisonous, but then he starts listing off the same things again for some reason. The ranger says he's going to hunt for some animals, and again, the DM starts listing off every possible animal he can think of in the woods. The ranger has to tell him that he will literally hunt anything, and after a survival check, runs across a rabbit. Ranger rolls to shoot with an 18, and misses? The DM tells him that bushes, shrubs, and the forest somehow made Ranger miss with an 18. 18, mind you, is plate armor status. Ranger has to continue chasing the rabbit, and the DM just drags the session on for another 10 minutes, with several of Ranger's shots still missing, until he finally lands a 23, which apparently was the magic number he needed to kill this rabbit. Trying to forage for food and cook takes us an entire hour of session time. We finally get to do the rest. We resume our journey, and the DM says that we finally find the bandit encampment. He starts clapping his hands again and goes, "Wow guys, another perfect 4-hour session ending right on time. This is going really well if I do say so myself. Okay, next week I'll get these bandit stats and find a map somewhere online for the battle." Yeah, I was done and quit the game. I perfectly understand that tabletop RPG isn't just finding a quest and doing a combat session, but when it takes 8 hours of forced interactions to finally just arrive at the bandits we were supposed to fight, when things are being dragged out, not for the sake of enriching a world, but just to eat up time, and random weather and falling trees impede a path just for the planned session time, the game kinda loses authenticity. Please people, a good game has both great preparation and improvisation. I can understand being a tad underprepared for a session, and that having improvisation skills is a plus for a DM to have. But this DM didn't seem to have that skill, and did no prep, which I really don't understand, because the DM had a path basically laid out for the first session, and a first session does kinda have to be a bit railroady to get the ball rolling. Maybe this was the guy's first time running a game, in which case, maybe he would have been better off running a module. That way, he could get a feel for how prep is done, without it getting too stressful, and just work on getting the improv skills in a natural way. Don't have people come to a game that's going to run on for hours if you don't even have anything planned after the "they leave the tavern" part. Though, those are just my thoughts. What do you guys think? Let's move on. Players just don't want a game. By Reddit user, "This is my phone though." I'm mostly posting here to vent. My players obviously aren't malicious, and I don't think anyone's at fault here. I'm just kind of flabbergasted and sad. We started this 5e campaign a couple years ago. We had a session 0, and I laid out some ground rules, some expectations, and I asked for theirs. They expressed interest in all 3 pillars of D&D, but less so in social. I mentioned I'd lean pretty heavily on the book, especially for spells, and not to expect any peasant railgun cheese to work. I was new to DMing, but had watched a ton of live play games, and was very confident in most of the rules. Everyone seemed on the same page, and we played for quite a while. We've told an, admittedly, meandering story of a party of quirky heroes following their whims through a generally bleak, dying setting with tangible pockets of sincere warmth. There have been some hang-ups, particularly with the party just wanting spells and magic to do what they want them to, instead of what they say on the card. Some of my combats were overtuned, some of the language in the book was too abstract for me to follow, and I made some bad calls. They'd very regularly want me to ignore text and spells that specifically disallowed what they wanted them to do. They'd also ask to do just impossible stuff, like, for example, stopping someone from snapping their fingers from 20 feet away. There's been a ton of griping about 5e and its oversimplified mechanics, and a general resistance to engage with any of the systems 5e offers besides combat. While everyone was enjoying the narrative, they often found the game parts of the game to be tedious at best, and teeth-pulling at the worst. I could feel small amounts of resentment building, and there was some butting of heads, so I eventually called a second session 0 to talk about some stuff. I asked some extremely open-ended questions, asked their opinions about some hypotheticals, and just talked to them. What I found, in essence, is that they don't want to play a game. I'll list some bullet points of stuff that we talked about, but I'd like to focus on what I thought was a salient example. Locked doors. I felt that more than a few failed attempts at a lock in most dungeon scenarios should break the lock, because otherwise there's no risk of failure in 99% of cases. The rogue felt that he should be able to make the checks until it works, and the lack of any real fail state didn't matter. I mentioned that he could play a commoner with a lockpick and get the same results in a lot, not all, scenarios, and he just didn't care. I asked why he leaned so hard into the lockpicking then, and he just said that he wanted to play a cat burglar. I asked why we were rolling to resolve a lock he could just brute force with no bonuses in a matter of minutes, and he said he wanted to pick locks and not remove the locked doors from the dungeons. Some other examples. Anytime, pressure is unwelcome. Dungeons should only change minimally on long rests. Basically, there shouldn't be any punishment for long resting, unless it's narratively obvious. And even then, it shouldn't matter. They should be able to do one combat a day if they want to, and it should work. The entirety of every dungeon should be explorable no matter what mistakes or failed checks they make. High-stakes choices are unwelcome. Almost any skill check should be repeatable, except for obvious exceptions, like trying to throw a single object at a far-off target across a gap. This includes out-of-combat exploration scenarios, like picking locks in a dungeon. Any optional rule that reduces their effectiveness is off the table. Gritty realism, encumbrance, lockpicks hurting locks, etc. Social rules should be basically boiled down to high-pressure persuasion checks, just working. They mentioned this wouldn't work in obvious situations, but their example of obvious was convincing people to harm themselves. They should be allowed to do impossible feats because they're heroes or villains. The example used was carrying a 2,000-pound obsidian statue up a 3,000-foot sheer cliff because 18 strength. I also used an example of stopping someone from snapping 20 feet away earlier because that has come up in play. They should be expected to win any dungeon or encounter, no matter how poorly they do. Quote-unquote win here means best case scenario. Obtain all loot and information possible. They want a way to freely teleport early, and would have liked to do so at level 3. Traveling for a week, even when it takes no table time and barely costs them 20 gold in supplies, is just not workable. They want more downtime, but not too much. Despite all this, they'd like to track things like item crafting and investments down to the hour. If they have a short rest in town during an adventure, they'd like that to contribute toward item crafting. Despite me trying to explain for close to 30 minutes, they don't understand what any of the above removes from the game. For example, there was a King of the Hill encounter, where more rounds on the goal equals more money, and they didn't understand why that shouldn't be repeatable indefinitely. They saw returning repeatedly the same as one long stay, mechanically. Basically, think 10 one-round combats versus one 10-round combat. All that is to say, while I can continue to design combat encounters, and while I do still enjoy the narrative, every aspect of the game outside of combat is just a waste of table time from my perspective. At the very best, we have the facade of mechanics. There will never be a risk of failure. Dungeon exploration is just combat encounters, and treasure with extra steps, and so are hex crawls. I wanted a game focused on choices. The dungeon is dangerous. How much are you willing to risk? If you have to, are you going to give up the faction objective or the money? What battles are you going to pick, and how far are you going to push yourself to advance your goals? What relationships are you willing to risk or leverage to get what you want? Are you going to travel here for a job, or there to save a town? I wanted to spotlight the character's agency by putting them in scenarios where their actions matter, but my players, effectively, just want hallways. They want the narrative to be written in such a way that all their objectives fall into their lap, that all the items, connections, gold, plot points, and everything else be impossible to avoid. I don't really know what to do. I'm probably just not going to resolve anything listed here and just move past it. Like, the door was locked with a DC 30, but you open it, at the absolute most, between 1 and 3 minutes. I'm struggling to find what they'd enjoy about any of this, and I'm almost doubting that they'd actually play the game they described. I also just don't want to waste table time on things that objectively will never impact anything. Yeah, it sounds like those players don't really want to play a game at all outside of combat encounters. What is the point of playing D&D if your actions don't have any bearing or consequence in the world you're playing in? I just don't get these players. I mean, one of the coolest things about playing a tabletop RPG is seeing how your decisions and actions impact the world around your characters. The sense that there is the possibility of failure is what makes the game exciting. At this point, I would suggest to OP that you just tell those players that you don't think you're a right fit for their playstyle, and that you don't want to run the game for them anymore. I mean, the DM is supposed to have fun playing too, and at this point, it sounds like it's quite the opposite for OP. Plus, you already tried the communication route, and it didn't bear any fruit. No D&D is better than bad D&D. But that is all we have time for today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may your games remain horror story free. Until next time.